The engine sputtered, then it caught, then it roared. It was just after midnight somewhere on a road in northern France. The headlights were blacked out. The driver couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. He was moving anyway. He had to. Behind him, 100 other trucks were doing the same thing, then 1,000, then more than you could count. A river of steel grinding through the dark, carrying gasoline, bullets, blood plasma, and food, carrying the weight of a war. Nobody in Berlin thought this was coming. Nobody thought it was even possible. They were wrong. To understand what happened in the late summer of 1944, you have to understand what the Germans believed about the Americans, not what they feared, what they actually believed, what their generals told each other in private, over maps and cigarettes and cold coffee. They believed the Americans could fight. They had learned that the hard way in North Africa and Sicily. They believed American equipment was good, sometimes excellent. They respected the Sherman tank more than they liked to admit, even if they thought their own armor was superior. They respected the American fighter plane. They respected American artillery. But logistics, supply lines, the dull, grinding, invisible work of keeping an army fed and fueled and armed across hundreds of miles of broken road, that, they believed, the Americans could not do. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had said it plainly. Senior Wehrmacht planners had built their entire defense strategy around it. The Atlantic Wall would be the first line. The second line would be distance. Because even if the Americans got ashore, even if they pushed inland, they would eventually outrun their own supply chain. They would stall. They would stop. And Germany would have time. Time to regroup. Time to bring up reserves. Time to turn the tide. It was a logical theory. It was a historically grounded theory. It was the theory that destroyed Napoleon's Grande Armée in Russia. It was the theory that had broken armies for centuries. You don't have to defeat an enemy if you can simply let him defeat himself. The Germans called it the tyranny of distance, and they were counting on it. What they did not count on was a group of mostly black American soldiers, a fleet of 2.5-ton GMC trucks, a stretch of road running from Normandy to the front lines, and the most audacious supply operation in the history of modern warfare. They did not count on the Red Ball Express. August 1944. Paris had just been liberated. The crowds were in the streets, weeping and laughing and waving flags. But about 200 miles to the east, near the German border, General George S. Patton's Third Army was doing something that had never quite been done before. It was moving, really moving. Not the grinding, methodical advance that characterized most of the war in Europe. This was a sprint. In 2 weeks, Patton's forces had covered more ground than the entire Allied army had covered in the 2 months since D-Day. They were covering 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles a day. Tanks, half-tracks, infantry and trucks, artillery pieces being towed at speed down French farm roads that had never seen anything heavier than a hay wagon. It was breathtaking. It was exactly what the Allied High Command had dreamed of. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. There was a real, visible, tangible chance to end the war before Christmas. There was just one problem. Patton's army was running out of fuel. The math was brutal and simple. Every Sherman tank burned about 50 gallons of gasoline per 100 miles. Every half-track, every truck, every jeep burned fuel. Patton had roughly 200,000 men moving at top speed across France. The nearest Allied supply depot was not 200 miles away. It was not 300 miles away. It was back near the beaches of Normandy. The original invasion plan had assumed a slow, methodical advance. It had not assumed this. The supply lines had not kept up. They couldn't keep up. The railroads in France had been bombed into rubble by Allied aircraft before the invasion, which had been the right call then. Now, with no working rail lines and no time to repair them, everything had to move by truck. And there weren't enough trucks, and the roads were clogged, and the fuel wasn't where it needed to be. Patton knew what was coming. He had seen it before in North Africa. You get rolling, you build momentum, and then logistics yanks the leash and everything stops. The Germans regroup. The window closes. He sent a message up the chain. He needed fuel. He needed it fast. He needed a solution that didn't exist yet. What came back was something nobody had ever tried before, at least not at this scale. The Army's Transportation Corps looked at the map. They looked at the trucks they had. They looked at the roads available. And then they proposed something audacious. They would dedicate a specific highway network exclusively to supply trucks, no other vehicles, no exceptions. Trucks going forward on one lane, empty trucks returning on another, around the clock. No stopping, no traffic jams, no delays for military convoys or tank columns or anything else. They would run it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from railroad slang for priority freight. Red Ball meant it moved fast and it moved first. It launched on August 25, 1944. Within days, it was moving 5,000 trucks over a dedicated circuit of roads covering more than 700 miles. The trucks were GMC CCWKW 2.5-ton tonners. Soldiers called them deuce-and-a-halves. Ugly, reliable, almost indestructible machines that could take a beating and keep moving. The drivers ran them day and night. The mechanics worked on them while they rolled. Some drivers slept while their truck was being loaded. The operation pushed human endurance to its absolute edge. Drivers were falling asleep at the wheel. Vehicles were breaking down and being repaired on the side of the road, only to be put right back into the circuit. The road surfaces began to deteriorate under the constant weight. Tires blew out by the hundreds. The army burned through spare parts faster than they could be shipped in from England. And yet, it worked. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was delivering 12,000 tons of supplies per day to the front. 12,000 tons. Gasoline, ammunition, food, boots, medical supplies, the lifeblood of an army in full motion. Now here is something the history books sometimes mention and then move past too quickly, something that deserves to be said clearly and fully. The majority of the drivers running the Red Ball Express were black American soldiers. This was 1944. The United States Army was still officially segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units under white officers and were largely kept away from combat roles. The official military thinking, wrapped in the language of tradition and practicality, was that black soldiers were best suited for support roles, transportation, supply, labor. What that thinking missed was that in this war, supply was everything. In this war, the men driving those trucks were not behind the front. They were the front. Without them, the tanks stopped. Without them, the guns went silent. Without them, Patton's army became a very expensive roadblock. The men of the Red Ball Express drove through the night with blacked-out headlights. They drove through air raids. They drove through ambushes by German stragglers who hadn't gotten the message that they were losing. They drove through mechanical breakdowns and exhaustion and roads turning to mud. They drove through it all. Many of them had grown up in a country that told them they were second-class citizens. Many of them left home knowing that German POWs held in American camps were eating better than black civilians in Alabama. They knew what America had and hadn't given them. They drove anyway, because the mission required it, and they were the ones there to do it. That is not a small thing. That is one of the great moral facts of the Second World War. Back at the front, Patton's army kept moving.
The fuel arrived. The guns stayed loaded. The tanks kept rolling. In the German high command, there was confusion. Their intelligence was telling them that Patton should have stalled by now, that the American logistics system should have broken down under the strain of a pursuit this fast across this much territory. They had planned for it. They had counted on it. It wasn't happening. Wehrmacht staff officers pored over their maps. The math didn't make sense. How was the American Third Army still moving? How were they still getting fuel? The German retreat was outpacing even the most pessimistic internal projections. Units that were supposed to form new defensive lines found the Americans already there, or arriving hours later at speed instead of the days or weeks the Germans had expected. The tyranny of distance was supposed to save Germany. Instead, American trucks were killing it one delivery at a time. There is a moment in any complex operation when it becomes clear whether the theory is going to hold. For the Germans, that moment came somewhere in September 1944, when it became undeniable that Patton was not stopping, that the American army was not going to starve itself to death in the middle of France, that the logistics wall the Wehrmacht had built their entire Western defense around was not materializing. The war was not over. There was still bitter fighting ahead. The The Germans would rally in the Hurtgen forest. They would launch a final desperate counterattack in the Ardennes that the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge. The war would drag on for another 9 months. But the strategic window Germany needed, the breathing room, the pause, the moment when the overextended Americans would have to pull back and regroup, that window had closed. The Red Ball Express had slammed it shut. The numbers tell part of the story. Between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, the Red Ball Express made approximately 412,000 trips. It delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies. It used somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 trucks at its peak. It operated for 83 consecutive days. But numbers don't capture what it meant to the men on the line. To a tank crew watching the fuel truck finally appear after 2 days of waiting. To an artillery battery getting ammunition resupplied in time to hold a position that might otherwise have been abandoned. To Patton himself, who understood better than almost anyone what logistics meant, who had once said that an army without supply is just a mob with guns. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous. There were no famous last stands along those supply roads. There were no moments that would become iconic scenes in films. There were just men and trucks and roads and gasoline and the grinding, relentless, exhausting work of keeping something enormous in motion. That is, in many ways, the real story of how the Second World War was won. Not just in the dramatic battles, not just in the famous generals, but in the factories of Detroit producing vehicles faster than any country in history had done before, in the shipyards of Mobile and Baltimore and Portland, launching vessels before the ones before them were finished, in the planning rooms where transportation corps officers who had run freight companies in peacetime applied quiet expertise to the problem of feeding a 2-million-man army in a foreign country, and in the hands and the eyes and the nerve of the men who drove those trucks through the night. Germany had built the most advanced war machine in European history. They had extraordinary engineers, innovative weapons, tactically brilliant officers, and soldiers of genuine courage. What they had misjudged was something harder to see, something that didn't fit easily on an order of battle or a map overlay. They had misjudged the industrial weight of a fully mobilized America. They had misjudged the organizational depth, the capacity to solve problems at speed, the willingness to improvise at scale. They had misjudged the determination of men who had something to prove. The Red Ball Express was not in anyone's plan when the war started. It was invented in days to solve a crisis that shouldn't have been solvable. It was manned by soldiers who were told by their own country that they were less than equal, and who responded by doing something irreplaceable. It was one of those moments where everything a society actually is, not what it says it is, but what it actually is, gets tested under pressure. America passed that test. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. Patton's tanks crossed the Moselle River with fuel in their tanks. The guns kept firing. The Third Army kept moving east. Somewhere in a German command post, a staff officer was staring at a map that no longer made sense. The line had moved again. The Americans were somewhere they weren't supposed to be yet. The supplies were still coming. He didn't know about the trucks. He didn't know about the roads. He didn't know about the men driving through the night with blacked-out headlights and borrowed time. But he was beginning to understand, in that deep and terrible way that comes when a theory meets reality and reality wins, that something had gone very wrong with the plan. The deuce and a halves were still rolling. The red ball was still running. History remembers the generals and the tank commanders and the men who stormed beaches. It should also remember the drivers. Every man who gripped a steering wheel in the dark and kept going, not because it was easy, not because his country had always treated him fairly, but because the mission required it, and he was the one there to do it. There is something worth sitting with in that. What do you think actually wins a war? The weapons, the generals, or the men the history books forget? Leave your answer below. Some of those answers might surprise you.